Hello, thank you for making your way back from lunch. I hope you had a nice break. I'm Amanda Schmidt. I'm the Program and Communications Officer for the Soufan Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce the next session, which will be the fireside chat on dynamics of security and development in the Middle East and North Africa. For this session, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Rami Khouri, Director of Global Engagement at American University of Beirut, as well as an adjunct professor of journalism and journalist in residence. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as our moderator, Dr. Colin P. Clarke, Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center and Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group. Please join me in welcoming Rami and Colin to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. It's been a great couple of days, and I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to Rami because I always learn something. I come away from these conversations smarter, and I always look forward to our next conversation. This one happens to be in person in Doha, so even better. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's jump right in. The first thing I want to ask you about is, I guess, a kind of broad, sweeping, strategic question, really spanning the gamut of the last 2 decades. 9/11, Afghanistan, the Arab Spring, all the way to today. Is there a common thread that runs through these events? And if so, what is it, or common threads, as it were?
Thank you, Colin. The interaction is mutually enjoyable and educational for me, too. I've always enjoyed reading your texts, and now glad to meet you. And thank you to the Soufan Center and group and the Qatari other co-hosts for this really powerful forum. I've learned a lot, and we still have some more sessions to go. The answer to your question is yes. There is a thread that runs through the last, I would say, really the last 30, 40 years of life and politics and legacies of national development or de-development throughout the Middle East and parts of South Asia. And it was captured rather dramatically in the last month with the American exit from Afghanistan, which was a little bit chaotic, and the Taliban moving right in. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why is it that after 20 years of the US leading a NATO assault against the Taliban and Qaeda and other groups, with all of the governments in the region, most of them joining this assault, incredible amount of firepower and focus to try to beat back these kinds of groups. Why is it that now, it's fascinating, we've been hearing in the last months that, and we heard it at some really great analysts here, that Al-Qaeda is still there and it's still expanding, and ISIS is getting a foothold in the Sahel, and these groups are multiplying in size and in reach, and they're still recruiting thousands and thousands of supporters. So you have to ask yourself, what's the reason for this? I think the reason answers your question, that there's a common thread, which is local bad government, partly corrupt, partly inept, partly uncaring, but broadly speaking, lousy governments at the local level across the region. And then you have nonstop foreign military intervention. In the case of the Arab world and the Middle East, the nonstop foreign intervention isn't just going back 30, 40, 50 years. It goes back to Napoleon in the late 1700s. We've had over 200 years of nonstop foreign militarism. It used to be mostly the French and the British back in the old days. And now you've got the Americans, you've got the Russians, you've got the Turks, you've got the Iranians, And Arab powers, the Emirates, the Saudis, even the Egyptians are looking around, and they're now all fighting in other people's countries. So that's another reason. The third one is we've had 100 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has had devastating impacts on most of these countries in the region, mainly by fomenting, indirectly, but fomenting military-run authoritarian states like Syria, like Libya, like Iraq, and others. So the combination of all those things has led to really lousy governance, misuse of resources, while the populations of the region were growing rapidly, leading ultimately to the situation that we've experienced in the last 10 years, which is nonstop popular uprisings in the Arab countries I'm talking now. It's an unprecedented phenomenon where you have mass uprisings in 8 or 10 countries at least on a big scale, some of which resulted in overthrows of regimes, some of which resulted in civil wars when the government fought back. Only one transitioned to a young democracy, which was Tunisia, and that's now faltering. But the fascinating thing and the important thing is that these continue. So you've got 4 countries now, Sudan, Lebanon, Algeria, and Iraq, where the big demonstrations, the big protests against the governments continue. And the reason this is happening is because of the underlying reality that for the majority of citizens in the majority of Arab countries throughout the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years, well-being has declined at the family level, at the community level, and at the national level. And that's defined in many different ways. We could talk about that. But broadly speaking, the well-being of an individual citizen, which had improved steadily from the 1930s till about the 1990s. We didn't have these mass national uprisings against their own governments. They revolted against Israeli occupation, against foreign colonial powers, but we never had what we have now, which is citizens en masse wanting to get rid of their governments. The whole government, this is also a new phenomenon. There's, in these 4 countries I mentioned, where there's been nonstop demonstrations for 2 years now, nonstop. Even under COVID, people keep going out. And they're demanding the total removal of the government. They're not saying change this minister, change this policy, raise our salaries. They're saying we want the entire ruling elite to get out of the way.
Let me stop you for a second, because I want to drill down on one of those countries you mentioned. And you mentioned Sudan, Lebanon, Algeria, and Iraq. And those were the case studies in the paper that you wrote for the Soufan Center, which is an excellent paper. And I urge everybody to go on our website, soufancenter.org, and read the paper. I just came back downstairs from watching the BBC, and if you've been tracking what's happening in one of the countries you mentioned, Lebanon, today, there's protests, there's gunfire, seemingly chaos in the streets. What are, and let's focus on Lebanon in particular, what are the underlying drivers of people's grievances? And I think you began alluding to it. And is the situation hopeless? If not, what can be done about it? And who should be doing it?
The drivers differ a little bit in every country, but there are some commonalities that we can identify. One of them is the lack of opportunities for a decent life. Not to be wealthy, not to be powerful, but just to live a decent life. To have a home and reasonable health care, reasonable education, a decent job, pension funded insurance, basic things that most people aspire to. Most people can't get those opportunities now in the Arab countries, outside the very wealthy countries. So if you take the oil producers like in the Gulf and about the other oil producers, Algeria, Libya and Iraq used to be in better shape, but they're in bad shape now. But the Gulf countries are a separate reality because of their wealth, small populations, and relatively well-managed governance systems. So you don't have mass helplessness, you don't have mass desperation in the Gulf, but you have it in almost every other Arab country. And if you had to summarize it in one word, I would use the word humiliation. People are really humiliated. They feel dehumanized. They feel that they're treated like animals by their own political rulers. They're not complaining about foreign occupation or Israeli colonization or settlement expansion or military attacks by foreign governments. That adds to the humiliation. But the basic issue is people are humiliated because they're not allowed to live like normal human beings. And when you break that down, it has many components: education, declining education quality, poor job prospects, poor incomes. Now about 65% of labor in the Arab world is informal labor, meaning no contract, no minimum wage, no health insurance, no pension, no safety protections. I mean, people are treated almost like donkeys in many situations, not every situation, but so this is the commonality. People are mistreated, can't live a normal, decent life, and have no power to do anything, no power to do anything about it. They don't have any kind of capacity through elections, through free media, through the courts. They don't have a way to redress their grievances. And so after years and years of not being able to do anything, they finally burst out in this explosion of protest and wanting to live a decent life. You mentioned Lebanon. Lebanon is a distinct case. It used to be different from all the Arab countries because of its demographic makeup, because of the sectarian nature of the government system that divided ministries according to religious groups. Right. Iraq became like that after the American invasion and has had lousy experiences as well. But Lebanon is not much different now than most of the other Arab countries, again, outside the oil producers. There's a trend of pauperization among the population, and there's a trend of militarization among the ruling elite. The government and its associates in the system, the power elite, are increasingly using military means to push back against the protesters, indict them, take them to jail, intimidate them, shoot at them sometimes. And then you have added layers of complexity in Lebanon, which today, for instance, it's Hezbollah and Amal, two major Shiite groups, who are protesting against the judge who's investigating the explosion at Beirut port. And that takes you back to some sectarian tensions that have always been a problem in countries like Lebanon and Iraq to some extent.
So you mentioned demographics, and I think, in my own research, the phenomenon of a youth bulge is always something that presents a complex challenge to governments, particularly when the government is already unable to provide basic services to the population. We'll touch on that, but I want to come back to this concept of humiliation, because again, in my own research on terrorism, violent extremism, it comes up again and again, and it's not just something that applies to Salafi jihadi groups or groups in the Middle East and North Africa. I first came across this concept doing research on the Provisional Irish Republican Army and trying to figure out why people joined, right? So looking at recruitment, and this concept came up again and again. People felt humiliated, and that this was their only option to restore some sense of basic dignity and pride, was to join a militant group and to fight against, in that case, the British Army. Can we talk a little bit more about this concept of humiliation and what kind of role it plays? Because I think it's actually understudied and underexplored when we talk about this. There's so much focus on terrorism and violent extremism, and we throw around terms like grievances and root causes, but humiliation is often left out of that conversation. So can we talk a little bit about how important that is and maybe why it's underexplored?
Yeah, this is really important, and it's been one of the great shocks of my modern recent life when I've lived in the United States now for over a year, to watch the American system, the public sphere, the media, government, others, to watch how they deal with the Afghanistan situation, which was big in the news, still is. And there was almost never a mention of ordinary people. It was Taliban, terrorism, and Americans who are threatened. And then the only time the people were mentioned was about women and girls, sure, who rightly should be educated and have a job. But again, they were just mentioned as this amorphous group. There was never...
But there's a lot missing there that we're not talking about.
Yes. then there's a lot of individual nuances in the people of Afghanistan, but they never really were presented as individuals with real life grievances and sentiments, except when that family was killed in the last drone attack as the Americans were leaving. They killed by accident a family. They thought it was a terror operation in the making. And then they started reporting a little bit about the family. But to get back to your question.
It's also amazing to think that people are just now waking up to the fact that there are civilian casualties in Afghanistan after 20 years. Where have people been looking for the last 20 years? This has been happening throughout the entirety of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, and it's only now becoming more of an issue.
Right, and so the basic problem is that ordinary human beings have, and in every country in the world, you have it in the US and Europe, they have certain deficiencies in life. You have unemployed people, you have people who are doing less well in school, that's normal. But in the Arab region, and this applies quite a bit to Afghanistan from what I read, I've never been to Afghanistan, but what you have is large-scale deprivation. So you're talking about poverty around, in the Arab countries, you have 70%, this is UN documentation, about 70% of Arab people are poor or vulnerable, meaning they're right on the edge of poverty and quickly plunge into poverty if the breadwinner stops working. 70%, that's gone up with COVID for sure. They're now identifying more sophisticated measures of poverty. The most traditional measures the World Bank and others used looked at how much money, $2 a day you spend or whatever. Now they're looking at what's called multidimensional poverty. They look at housing conditions, educational conditions, environmental situations. And just recently, there's been even a more sophisticated analysis of poor people, of poverty, done by the Oxford Poverty Study Group, and there's an international network that studies multidimensional poverty now, which is quite fascinating. But they're looking now at material deprivations, housing, jobs, income, insurance, food, things like that. But also they're looking at non-material deprivations, helplessness, powerlessness, feeling of shame, mistreatment of poor people by society as a whole, and the constant struggle of poor people just to be heard, to have a voice. So it's all of these material and non-material things together, these deprivations together, that create a sense of humiliation in ordinary people. And when you have this on a large scale, I'm not saying that 70% of the people who are poor are all going to become extremists, but some of them do. That's where extremism comes from. Or they get on a boat and risk going to Europe and dying on the way. One person was quoted as saying that I'm getting on a boat because the risk of dying on a boat to go to Europe is less than the risk of my staying in my country and dying in my country as a poor person. So the issue of how deprived and mistreated people react is important, because most of them don't become extremists and terrorists. Some of them emigrate if they can. Some of them just switch off and just grow their food and take care of their family and their own community. Some of them join militias. Some of them join religious groups and social groups that help other people. There's many ways that people react to their deprivation and helplessness. And these are ancient societies. People have lived in these communities in the Arab countries for 7,000 to 8,000 years in settled communities. They've got deeply tested structures of solidarity and cohesion and assistance to poor people. Some of them are religious, most of them are just tribal, some of them are based on ethnic or national groups. But so poor people don't automatically fall off the edge and become drug addicts or thieves or criminals. Poor people have a tougher time in society, but they don't necessarily end up being a danger to society, except a few who do go off and join terror groups. Right. And this is why these strategies that the NATO countries and Arab and other Middle Eastern countries have developed to fight the security threat that comes from terror have largely failed. And if the terror groups are still growing and expanding, it's time to look at a different strategy. And that requires really acknowledging the human reality in society and trying to address it, which is really hard, because you're then dealing with these autocratic governments who don't want to reform, who don't want to change. But there is no option other than to see how these corrupted, abused societies can be transformed into more productive and vital, creative and pluralistic societies.
We've talked about terrorist groups, militias, violent extremist organizations. When we talk about failed states and ungoverned spaces, it's impossible not to talk about these groups. Do we focus too much on terrorism when we talk about the Middle East, particularly from a Western perspective? You've seen it from both sides. You've lived in the region, you've lived in the United States. As a journalist, professor, scholar of these issues, your own work is perhaps among the most well-rounded on this issue that looks at it from a true 360-degree view. In your opinion, in the West, do we focus too much on terrorism in kind of occupying the bandwidth of all the analysis that we see? And if we do, how do we kind of move the needle back to a more nuanced analysis and discussion like you and I are having right now?
I think the West, broadly speaking, focuses too much on the military response to terrorism. Terrorism is a real problem, it's a real threat, and it's a bigger threat to people in the region than it is to people outside. But it has to be seen as a symptom of deeper problems in societies. So you should pay attention to it and respond to it. Responding as the NATO and Western and Arab countries have done through a military-first policy doesn't work. It clearly has failed. It's been counterproductive, in fact, because one of the studies that was done in East Africa by the UN, looking at some of the groups that follow Shabab, the terror groups, interviewing some of the young recruits, and they asked them, what motivates you? Why did you join these groups? And they said it was because the way we were treated by our governments as well as by international military action. So the combination of bad governance in the Arab region with foreign military intervention together, which you had in Afghanistan on a big scale, bigger than anything in the Arab region, has been a real failure. And so the challenge is, what do you do to deal with terrorism? There is only one option, which is you take military action when you need to for a very short period of time, as they did when they attacked Qaeda in Afghanistan at the beginning, or you stop a terror action that's in process. Sometimes that's obviously legitimate. But in the long run, this problem can only be solved by working with the governments and the political elites in these countries to reform the systems. And that's really hard. One of the biggest priorities that I've preached for years is for Arab societies and foreign societies, whether they're Western or Russian or Chinese or Iranian, whatever they may be, is for us to jointly agree on what is the legitimate and effective way for foreign countries to engage in our countries, or foreign groups like the UN or whatever, or even Oxfam or international agencies, all of whom are trying to do good work for our benefit, but most of them are engaging in a way that is run according to their rules and priorities, not sufficiently consulting with local people. So you need a more consultative process in which Arabs and foreigners together decide what's the problem, how do we move towards a resolution. And this is where you get the real tough problem, which is that the ruling elites in the Arab countries, governments, private sector, tribal, traditional, ethnic leaders, whatever, the people who control the power structure don't want to change it. And we've seen this in the last 10 years of nonstop uprisings, where people have clearly risen up saying, we want this system to change. The ruling elites have learned to respond by ignoring some of the demands, making short little symbolic reform pledges, which they generally don't carry out, or beating people militarily or taking them to jail. So it's very hard to change ruling elites, systems that have been in power for 20, 30, 40 years, control the money and the guns, and have clientelist networks that are very, very deep. It's not easy to change these things, and this is the new dilemma that we have to deal with. And what people in the Middle East say to our Western friends, look, you supported these elites, you still support them. If you look at what's going on in countries like Egypt, for instance, or other Arab countries, they're supported to the hilt by Western, the US and others. And so the Western countries have to really take a deep look at how their policies, military force against terror, supporting autocratic regimes, how do these policies end up impacting ordinary people in their homes and villages? And this is what's not been done and is needed.
So I think one of the, and that's a point very well taken, I think one of the dilemmas we're facing now is, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which, as we've discussed several times and throughout the course of the last few days at this forum, the evacuation, the withdrawal has been botched, right? It was a debacle. Few would argue with that. We're seeing, some might argue, a retrenchment of the United States certainly from South Asia, from the Middle East. And this concept of nation building has become a dirty word or a pejorative. But that seems to me almost what you're suggesting the United States and Western countries should be thinking about, not nation building with a military, but helping governments in the region to connect with their people. The divide seems to be between the elites and the people, though, and that's not something that a Western country is going to be able to forge. That's got to happen organically. So I've called it in the past the Humpty Dumpty problem, meaning states break easily, but they're difficult to put back together. Right. And we talk about fragile, weak states, and it's very much been securitized. So the West cares about fragile states when, terrorist groups can gather there. But otherwise, that's not really our domain. Moreover, you have a growing domestic pressure of why should the United States or any other country be doing things abroad when we have our own problems at home, problems that have been exacerbated by COVID-19 and many other issues. So how do you convince Western governments, their populations, that they can and should be helping these countries and that's not something that's going to come back and bite them?
Well, it's not easily done, but it can be done, and it should be done. And the reason is, the first thing that you need to do is recognize, people in the West should recognize that ordinary Arabs, and I'm talking of the Arab world now, Iran, Afghanistan, other places I don't know, Iran I know a little bit, but Afghanistan I haven't been, but this applies to foreign policy challenges all over the region. The first thing is to recognize that the Arab people, ordinary people, there's 440 million Arabs now, and the surveys and the studies that have been done by really competent groups,
Arab Barometer
Arab and Western, Gallup and the Arab centers here in Doha, they do a survey, the Arab Barometer group, there's some really sophisticated polling and surveys that are done year after year. We now know, which we didn't 20, 30 years ago when I started in this business. I started 45 years ago, but we didn't know back then. We felt instinctively what people feel, but now there's evidence. We know that the overwhelming majority of Arab people want to live in democratic societies. They share the same values, broadly speaking, as the West, and freedom, pluralism, accountability, equal rights, rule of law. There's a few areas where they diverge because of their cultural traditions, related mostly to sexuality, and some patriarchal things, but there's a strong affinity between ordinary Arabs and Western democratic, constitutional, and pluralistic societies. So there's a strong base to build on if people want to do that. The problem is that these sentiments and values and views of ordinary Arabs are never taken into consideration. The flip side of that is these same Arabs, when they're surveyed, they're asked, who do you see as your main security threat? A majority of them say the United States and Israel, for obvious reasons. So there is a serious problem in terms of how, if we take the US only, how US foreign policy is understood or absorbed by people and ordinary people in the Arab world. So a military leader of an Arab country, a military dictator who took power by a coup, will give you an opinion that we want to be close friends with the US and help us train our army, whereas the vast majority of people in that country want to get rid of that dictatorship, and they don't want foreign aid only for military, they want foreign aid for education and farming and healthcare and things like that. So there is a base on which we can build better collaboration between Western countries and the Arab world. There's been a massive waste of resources, really huge, hundreds of billions of dollars that from the Europeans, from the Americans, from other countries in the West over the last 30, 40 years. I've lived there this whole time, I've watched it happen, and this has to stop. And the only way it can be fixed is to get the voices, interests, and sentiments of ordinary people involved in the decision-making process. And that can be done without having a democratic system, because we're not going to get democracies right away. We will eventually, I'm sure of it. But you can get consultative mechanisms where individuals, university people, trade unions, school teachers, whatever, men, women, all kinds of people can be involved in looking at decisions and helping to shape how foreign aid is actually used.
Rami, Khouri's got a magic wand for the day. Your paper talks about a lot of these issues and the pauperization, which I think is really powerful, issues like mass migration, brain drain. What do you use that magic wand to do if you could solve just one problem? And I know there's many. What do you go for? Do you go for low-hanging fruit?
In terms of reforms?
Yeah.
Oh, I think there's no question about it. There's actually two, and you can't separate them. One is the rule of law, and two is freedom of expression. You can't help a society change if you can't hear what their people are saying. Freedom of expression is absolutely critical, and that's why many Arab governments are using high-tech capabilities, some of which they buy from Israel and other places, and Russia and
Sure.
to silence their critics on social media, or even not on social media. They just have surveillance systems. So you've got to have freedom of expression, whether it's through the media or other mechanisms, and you've got to have the rule of law. You can do this without a democracy initially, but it sounds weird, but the democratic constitutional process with parties and elections and accountability through the legislature, that takes more time, and it will happen eventually. But initially, I would say rule of law, an independent judiciary, and freedom of expression.
Something that comes up a lot in my own research is this concept of sectarianism. And there are some out there that argue that it's gotten worse over the decades and over the years. Where do you see these trend lines going? And if you think that sectarianism is going to get worse, how do we begin to kind of pull back from the brink? Or is this something that, we just learn to live with and mitigate?
Sectarianism, first of all, doesn't hurt the entire Arab world. Many Arab countries don't have different sectarian groups, but where they do exist, like Lebanon or Iraq or Sudan or other places.
And I even mean broader throughout the region, the whole kind of Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia and how that impacts others.
Okay, so
geopolitically.
There I would say, again, that Iran-Saudi Arabian situation has been vastly over-exaggerated by Western analysts and governments. The Saudis and Iranians are now in their fourth round of talks. They understand that the region has to be shaped by its own people. They know that. But sectarianism has been used both internally in some countries and regionally to foment distrust and fear. And it's been used partly by the local elites but also partly by foreign powers. I mean, if the sectarian tensions in Lebanon have always been there. There was problems in the 1860s with the Druze and the Christians and this, but the French colonial powers and the British colonial powers exploited these sectarian differences, and when these countries became independent, the sectarianism was kind of institutionalized. And when the Americans went into Iraq and brought down the old Ba'athist system, and Paul Bremer, who knew about as much about Iraq as I know about the dark side of the moon, he came in and set up this system of, he wanted to do primaries. He thought he was in Kansas.
Coalition Provisional Authority.
And so he created this ridiculous system of sectarian apportionment, which has led to the problems, partly to the problems we have today. The previous regime in Iraq should be blamed for a lot of it, but the Americans just made it worse. So foreign meddling and political elites who take advantage of people's fears have both made sectarianism a bigger problem than it is. One of the striking things we saw in the uprisings, especially in Lebanon and Iraq, where sectarianism has been institutionalized, was the massive anti-sectarian sentiment of the protesters in the street. And we know from reality on the ground and surveys that about 70–80% of the people of these countries support the protests. They want the government to really reform. And what you had on the street is tremendous inter-religious solidarity and people saying that, my gosh, I never met somebody from the South, or I never met somebody from this group. And when they meet, they said, we realize we suffer the same issues.
Right.
We want the same things. And so they started to develop a national sentiment as citizens of this country, whether it's Lebanon or Sudan or Iraq, it doesn't matter. But this human instinct to live together in peace with your fellow compatriots or nationals quickly affirmed itself once they had a chance to do it. So the sectarian issue is vastly overblown, and it is a consequence of mismanagement internally as well as international penetration of our region.
So it's kind of amazing. We're actually we only have a few minutes left. I mean, time flies when every time I end up talking to you again. It's just and I learn so much. As we close out, we'll hone in on one of the themes of the forum and of the conference, which is cooperation. What's your take on the Abraham Accords, and do you think it's something that's durable? I've been quite critical myself. I think I've called it window dressing in some cases. Other people have been a bit more optimistic and think that there's promise there. Is this true cooperation? Is it going to lead to any kind of real change, or is this much ado about nothing?
The Abraham Accords are a mercantile business operation among elites who have reasons to want to create new relationships, whether Arab countries who are fearful and want external protection, and some of them are looking for Israel to protect it, or they want to get technology, surveillance technology, or they want to buy American advanced weapons and therefore they do this, or they want to get off the terrorist list, therefore they do this.
Right.
This is a mercantile operation. This is the bazaar in action. You make a deal, you get something, you give something.
Quid pro quo, although that term is
Yeah,
kind of
but
loaded
only
these
among
days.
elites. This is not a people-to-people.
Sure.
There's evidence, we have clear evidence now, that the majority of people in these countries do not really fervently support these, and in many of these countries, they're afraid to say so because they'll get thrown in jail. So I would not take them seriously. They are a sign of some desperation among political elites and some amateurism in national leadership, both in the United States and in the region. So I would not pay much attention to them. They are a reality. And by the way, the Arab countries have all expressed a wish to live in peace with Israel through the Arab peace plan. We have all said, every single Arab country signed on to the Arab peace plan, which the Saudis initiated, that we will live in total peace and open borders and trade with Israel as long as it lives with the Palestinian state that has its rights, and the refugee issue is resolved according to UN resolutions and to the satisfaction of both sides. So we've given the Israelis a very serious and reasonable opening for the Israelis to have agreements, not just with all the Arab countries, but with another 30 or 40 Muslim majority countries that have agreed. So that's the way to do it. Address the core issues, the Zionist, Arabist, or Palestine-Israel conflict, address it to the needs of both sides, legitimate needs, and then you'll have a better ending.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I can't believe it's come to a close already. So I just want to thank you for your time and for your wisdom. And again, for those that are watching online, those in the audience, go ahead to the SoufanCenter.org, to our website, and you can read the paper that Rami wrote, which focuses on the themes that we talked about here today, as well as case studies on Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon as well. So thank you very much. Thank you to the State of Qatar for the hospitality, and to the Global Security Forum once again for just another amazing couple of days here, talking about issues that really matter and solutions that we hope we could achieve.
And thanks to the Soufan Center and group for showing, and for the Qatari hosts as well, co-hosts, what happens when you get people together who disagree on many things, but talk about them and find the common ground that reflects their shared humanity. So thank you all for doing this.
Thank you.